I've been making a film about female mental illness issues, and I've been looking at some of the research that I've collected, and we're talking about, let me see here, 1995. This one's gender and psychiatric disability rehabilitation support centres. That's 2000. Here we go, the Young Women's Pilot Outreach Project, July 1993. Now, the reason why I've been collecting these things is because with female policy, including government policy, there's been, since 1990 when I first started in the sector, there's been a lot of reinventing the wheel. And we have a research report here that says one thing, and then 3 years later, we have another research project that says exactly the same thing.
At Bendigo
Yes.
Hospital, when I went in there, the place was just chaotic, and there were both sexes, all age groups. But what I did observe was this poor old lady who was just quietly rocking to herself in a corner, and this young fellow who can't have been more than 15 or 16, absolutely persecuting her and dancing around, prodding her, and she was just totally disoriented and terribly upset. This lady must have been over 80. There's obviously a strength difference. It's not a safe place. I can't imagine that the way the wards are at the moment, that they pass any OH&S standards.
When I was in Larundel in 1991 in a ward, the locked ward, I was stalked by a male patient. And I felt intimidated by this man. I felt threatened by this man. I reported this to the staff. They thought it was part of my delusional world. I wasn't made to feel safe in that ward, and because it was a locked ward, I couldn't get away from this man. This is not a new thing for women in psych wards.
That confined space too. If you do go and complain and say this male patient's giving me grief, then they might believe you, but then they just say, well, stay away from him. How do you stay away from him in an environment like that?
20 years ago, not in 89-90, I was involved in a statewide audit of all the 19 institutions, and my job was to go in and interview the patients about their experiences. And I interviewed hundreds of patients across the institutions. One of the questions I would ask is, have you had anything traumatic happen to you while you were in hospital? And a number of women had indicated that they'd been raped either by staff or other patients.
Sally and I were recently reviewing OPA's community visitor reports as early as 1992, and we came across comments in 1992 about assaults of women, about the lack of dignity for women on wards, being given clothing that exposes them. They were talking about gowns that were split up the back and men being given pyjamas. So this is an issue that's been around a very long time, and I'm not surprised that the issue is still a live one, because community visitors in our last annual report are still reporting that there's issues around the safety of women in mental health units.
I realised quite early on in my job that women were reporting issues of not feeling safe in psychiatric wards, that women were being sexually assaulted, they were being harassed. So, for instance, in 1993, I was asked to represent a woman who took a claim against the Department of Health regarding her sexual assault in a psychiatric inpatient facility by a male nurse. Now, when we started investigating that matter, in gathering together the material, we came across material that identified that this male staff member had sexually assaulted 2 other women. It's all staff members, male or female, having sexual relationship with a person with impaired mental functioning is a crime under the Crimes Act. It's unlawful.
It's clearly a problem. Yesterday I was at work. I mentioned to a bloke down there, I said, I'm filming tomorrow, we're going to be filming a group of men discussing the issues around single-sex wards, because when people are admitted, they're quite vulnerable. They might lose their inhibitions. And he said, oh yeah, I had a mate who was a drunk, and he'd voluntarily get himself committed because it's the only place he could get sex, because he knew that in there the women would be more open than they would if they were in their right mind. Yeah, well, I was almost hesitant to tell Sue that story, and as soon as I did tell it to her today, she told me a very, very similar story about another bloke she knew who did exactly the same thing, but he was actually diagnosed with a mental illness. He wasn't an alcoholic, and she said that he'd masturbate in public in order to get committed, so then when he was in there, he could have sex.
That's the problem now. A lot of predators around, if they're given the opportunity, they will predate. You don't want people getting into psych wards just to abuse people.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of shows that you need women-only wards.
Once again, the last hospital admission I had, there was this guy who was hitting on this young female who'd come in, and a lot of the time new female patients are seen as fresh meat in a way to some of the predatory type guys, and he kept hitting on this woman, and myself and others had told the staff that this was going on, but they just ignored it. And so I told him, I said, leave her alone, she's vulnerable, leave her alone, stop doing that. And he got stuck into me verbally to start with and said, oh, you're just a big fat slut with men's balls. And that was horrible. It really got to me. But anyway, he kept on with this verbal abuse. And a male nurse was standing really close by and he didn't do anything. And then the guy was started to come across and said, I'm going to knock your block off, and was about to hit me. Then the male nurse stepped in, but only then. And then he just shooed the guy away, didn't do anything else, and said to me, oh, when he was out of earshot, oh, it's good you stuck up for yourself, Julie. And I thought, well, why
aren't you sticking up for me as well?
Yeah.
We have I think, a far too high suicide rate. I mean, clearly one suicide is one too many, but we have 25 people a year suicide within 5 weeks of discharge from hospital. I think that's outrageous. And I think that those things can happen because you can pretty much pick up any medical file in this state and you will rarely find a sentence about how the person's feeling.
I've had friends who've been raped in hospital and they've ended up suiciding. And so, you know, it's fine for nurses to say, oh, don't worry about it, he's sick, he's just a male patient, you've got to expect that sort of behaviour. Well, no, we don't have to expect that sort of behaviour, and it can have tragic repercussions.
I've heard of someone who was raped in Murrundle in A ward, and they always claimed they were raped, and her friends always said to her, why didn't you tell the staff that this happened? And she said, because they would never believe me. She's since suicided.
I think one of the things is that women with psych disabilities aren't believed. There was one case where one woman said staff nurse had sexually assaulted her, and she was ignored and not believed, until 5 other women gave the same story.
It always shocks me how many people are willing to believe or to say that women would make up an allegation of sexual assault, because going through the system is harrowing.
All too often that judgments are made by staff in the first instance that it was a person imagined it didn't happen, or we don't want to expose any of these problems to the wider world, so staff don't report it. When it is reported to police, we find again all too often the person is not believed. But if they are believed and it is taken to the next level, there's the concern about, will the person be reliable? Can they give consistent evidence in court? So all too often it doesn't get to court. And when it does get to court, we know how difficult it is for women to win cases of sexual assault. So the system is really stacked against a woman reporting, but particularly a woman with a disability or a mental illness.
We've had a fair amount of feedback over periods of time that families are concerned that those environments don't feel safe, particularly if you think of young women who then would go to an adult ward. That can be more confronting for the family than the actual hospital experience and the experience of mental illness, is that they were suddenly on a ward with much, much older men and feeling not confident. It may have been the first time that young person had stayed away from home for an extended period.
An awful lot of phone calls people generally are people from within the involuntary system. And one way or another, it's about them losing control. Losing control of where they can allowed to be because they can be forced into hospital, of what medicines go in their body. And certainly we've had a number of women who've had either direct assault issues or just bloody uncomfortable about having forced into a place with 12 to 20 guys who are, by definition, not in best control of themselves. Like I say, I think a lot of parts of your life are taken out of your control, and who you associate with should be something that you do have some control of day by day.
I think the other thing that's really important that we haven't spoken about yet is also the fact that about 70%, 70 or 80% of the women, as you know, who are in the units have experienced previous sexual abuse.
Yes.
And then who are confronted with often quite aggressive men.
I mean, men rape and bash women all the time in general society, so why wouldn't it happen in a psych ward? It's just that in a psych ward there's got better access to bashing to being violent towards women because they're a contained cohort.
I think part of it too is that for men in the community, they're given a more powerful standing in their culture, how they're brought up in environment than women. They get put in a psychiatric unit, they lose that. The staff are down on them. And they lose, you know, a lot of the time in the psychiatric hospital, you get treated like you're a child, really, which can be hard for anyone to swallow. But for the men, they then pass that on to the next rank down, which is the women in the ward. So
there's such an abundance of evidence of abuse towards women in environments, to their feelings of oppression, to their feelings of not feeling safe, at a very fundamental, personal level.
You know, men can be subject to assault, they can, you know, be fearful of assault in detention and psychiatric services, but it is nowhere near as prevalent for them as it is for women, and you've got to prioritise.
they're not all sex crazy, hardened, you know, rough men that are going to do you in. There's some really gentle guys within the mental health networks, but if they stick up for female patients, they either get ostracised or they get into fights and they get beaten up. So then they decide, okay, I'm not going to get involved in this.
I don't subscribe to the view that perpetrators of abuse are only from one gender, but I think the ultimate objective should be to provide a safe and caring environment for people who are forced to endure unwanted medical treatment, whatever that might look like.
And you know, like, we're mentally ill as well. We don't go around sexually assaulting people, sexually harassing people. And it's, you know, the fact that it is a male-specific thing is indicative of this larger culture, because mentally ill women, like, sometimes do, but to a much lesser extent than men, do assault or harass other inpatients. But the fact that it's a male thing is so, and that it often gets excused as, oh, they're sick too, you know.
There is no excuse for violence against women, and the state of a person's mental health is not an excuse to exploit, assault, physically or sexually assault another person. And the service providers have a duty of care for the individuals in their service, and that is to ensure that they maintain at all times a safe environment. And you cannot use a person's ill health as an excuse to sweep the assaulted women under the carpet.
When I was in hospital, there was a woman with a thick European accent, and she was wandering around the ward going, he raped me, and so everyone got to hear. I went to the nursing staff and I said, look, I'm worried about this, you know, it makes her a target. Anyway, we're in the recreation room, and the bloke walks in and he turns to this woman and he exposes himself, and she went catatonic. And then I got told, he's sick.
Yeah.
They say he's unwell too, as though that excuses his behaviour. I find that one, the idea that he is unwell too, therefore you have to put up with his behaviour and feel threatened by it when you're trying to get better get your mental health better by being in a place that's supposed to make you safe and cared for. It's so counterintuitive and it's counterproductive.
The issue that has struck me regarding women who have mental illness is just the systemic discrimination against women across the board in all sorts of areas, and it is not something that has improved.
I believe that there's an attitude in mental health that a female patient who is sexually assaulted, it is less important than it is for ordinary women out in the community.
This is a systemic problem, and also going through this woman's psychiatric file and reading the nurse's notes. The nurses were saying this client was behaving provocatively, that she was disinhibited, that they did not believe her reports. Now, this would not occur in the general community.
You know, there was a report on the 7:30 report about exactly the depth and nature of the sexual assaults taking place in the psychiatric system, and it was just like, if this were happening in an oncology ward, there wouldn't be the same complacency.
But there is this, I think, unconscious attitude that they don't matter as much, or that it has less of an impact.
It's dreadful, the horrible situation, and of course then women, if they complain, are frequently put into high dependency units or the intensive care units, and they are more vulnerable there.
And I mean, what we see appallingly is community visitors report cases where a woman might report sexual assault and she's then put in seclusion, punished, and people will argue, services will argue, well, that's the only space we had where we could ensure her safety. So in the absence of women-only services, women continue to be punished and confined and restrained when they report incidents of sexual assault and sexual abuse.
A majority of female psychiatric patients have a history of past abuse, and even if violence isn't directed directly at them on the ward, just witnessing the aggression that goes on between male patients a lot of the time, that can re-trigger all sorts of issues for them.
A number of women spoke about, we saw other women being sexually abused, and that was very distressing for them as well. Just seeing the sexual abuse, even if they were not sexually abused themselves, it was very traumatising.
An enormous percentage of women have experienced abuse of one sort or another. And when you get back in the system having had abuse in the past, things can get triggered. Even the trivial being told what to do, get out of here, it's not time yet. If you've had the wrong experiences, and particularly if you've had experience of having men try and use their strength and authority to make you do stuff, I can't even imagine being held down by 5 or 6 security guards is a standard part of experience. If somebody refuses to do something, and I can't imagine what that feels, except I know that I'd sicken to my stomach if it happened to my daughter.
One woman who ended up in hospital for 12 months, and she had been sexually assaulted previously, but she also had manic depression, and she was talking to one of those nurses many years later. They agreed that had the sexual assault issues been dealt with in the psych hospital better, that she wouldn't have been that sick.
70% of women admitted to psychiatric hospitals have been sexually assaulted prior to that. So, it needs to be dealt with, because it's a huge cause of mental illness and it's a huge exacerbator of mental illness in women.
I mean, let's face it, if it was 10% or 20%, it would be an urgent issue to be dealt with. But the sexual assault, actual assault or reported assault figures don't go anywhere near unreported assaults, and there are a whole lot of reasons why that might happen, but they also don't go near the counter-therapeutic impact of being in an environment where you may be fearful of being assaulted or where you may be being re-traumatised.
I think that in relation to the primary purpose of involuntary mental health treatment, which is supporting people through a terribly difficult time to move from being unwell to recovery. If the purpose is recovery, it makes no sense to me to heighten people's stress by placing women in mixed wards where they are not only forced to endure the unwanted invasive medical treatment and the accompanying loss of autonomy that goes with that, but to also be fearful of some victimisation, assault or simply re-traumatisation by being exposed to people who they fear or who can reasonably be fearful of. So to not create a safe environment seems to me to be counterintuitive to the purposes of the medical intervention, which is recovery.
I think that the possibility of women-only wards and the money that might save through women not being readmitted is real.
We've all heard enough stories about what can go wrong and the lack of safe space. I think there's also a cultural demand that we need to be more sensitive to the needs of women from different cultural backgrounds. And it seems the time, we've made the moves to the community. We can be more sophisticated now in the way we apply things. So it's not a knee-jerk reaction. This is a logical, well-evidenced time to make gender-sensitive space for women.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember when I was working at Dandenong Hospital that we did a survey then, that was going back to 1996. And again, a large number of people from Middle Eastern background were very clear that women and men should not be in the same area. So that was something that they were quite horrified about, actually, mixed wards.
A lot of ARAFMI's work are in the northern and southern regions of Victoria, where there's high populations of women from the Horn of Africa and high populations of Muslim women. And it's certainly very confronting for them to go in an environment where there would be men. And certainly the women are not feeling equipped in those environments to know how to deal with already feeling vulnerable because they're in a mental health facility. So they're the most unwell they've been. They're feeling vulnerable, and then they also have to contend with a range of behaviours from other people, including men, that don't respect their personal space and privacy and beliefs around separation between men and women.
We actually had a situation in my last hospital admission. There was a Muslim woman in there, and she had to share bathroom facilities with male patients. And she felt she couldn't use the bathroom facilities, and so she just urinated on the couch where she was sitting because she was too scared to actually move and go anywhere. And she mustn't have felt confident approaching the staff and saying, I need separate facilities. I mean, it should be standard practice that the staff realise these things. And then, to my horror, later in that woman's admission, she was given ECT. And she wore one of the headscarves. And when she'd come back from ECT, her headscarf, she'd come back in a wheelchair and her headscarf would be off her head. And she'd be still a bit out of it, and she'd desperately be feeling around her head, trying to adjust her headscarf that wasn't even there anymore. And so she was very distressed because this was a mixed ward and there were males there, and she felt she was not appropriately dressed.
So there was no sensitivity towards her ethnic requirements by the staff. When they gave her ECT, they should have known what her needs were.
It just is another highlight of why the mix of male and female in one ward can be such an issue, and especially for cold patients.
That workshop about gender-only wards, and the people from, the representatives from India, Sri Lanka, from Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, so all throughout Asia and Southeast Asia, people just stared at us like, what planet are you on? Because they have gender-specific wards, because it's the way they saw it, that men and women were treated separately. And when we start talking about guidelines to help with promoting gender sensitivity and all this sort of stuff, they just look at us like, you don't do guidelines and policies, you just separate the men and women.
The other thing, even later on, visiting you at Royal Melbourne Hospital, now we have the physically frail mixing with the mentally frail. Now, that's not fair to either of them, but particularly not to the physical frail. And I think, What sort of a society are we? How much do we really care when we let this happen?
There is a huge intersection between mentally ill women and sex workers, and there's a huge intersection between mentally ill women and women who use drugs or alcohol, and mentally ill women who are Indigenous or who are queer or who are otherwise minorities.
I've had terrible homophobic experiences from both staff and patients. All I've ever done in an open ward with a girlfriend is hold hands on the couch. We haven't been kissing, we haven't been touching each other, we've just held hands on the couch. One instance, as I was leaving the unit, I was getting these sexist comments from the guys. I was walking out the door, I heard a rattling of the window, I turned around to look, and there was a guy there and he dropped his pants. And I didn't want to go back to the hospital and visit my friend after that. And another incident was from the male staff, and they were saying, this was when I was an inpatient, and they were saying all you need is a good screw. And it had terrible consequences, because I then went down to the local pickup park thinking that if I had a good screw, my mental illness would be cured, and they'd let me out of hospital. Fortunately, this really nice guy came along and saw I was mentally unwell and drove me back to the hospital and walked me in. But what would have happened if I'd gotten some creep come up and taken advantage of me?
With such a high percentage of LGBT people having mental illnesses, and with 42% of the transgender population have attempted suicide at some point. 42% is huge, and so you have to have gender considerations always, I think, in mental health care. There is a problem with putting trans men in male-only wards, because they're often perceived as female, or even if they have a vagina, that's a real problem. Both trans women are even more at risk of being assaulted in a mixed-sex ward, or a male ward especially, than they are anywhere else. So I think if you identify as a woman, you should absolutely be put in a women's ward. And also the fact that the more marginalised you are, the more likely you are to be assaulted, and even in an environment like a mental health ward.
I think we need to look at people on an individual basis. People's needs are unique, people are uniquely human, and whether people identify as same-sex attracted, whether people are young, whether people are old, whether people come from an ethnic minority, it's really important that we suspend our bias or our use of stereotypes to compartmentalise people into boxes to make it easier for us to process them, because when we do, we've lost our empathy and we've lost our concern for someone's individual human rights. I think as a community, we're better off when we see the individual before us rather than the stereotype we carry in our head.
What it really means is we've got to be able to look at the individual. Gender is part of the individual, but we've got to look at all the individual aspects when we're trying to provide a program of care for people with mental illness.
The knowledge that there are drugs that can make people violent and things, and people are coming in with, it's another incentive to make sure that patients who are likely to cause harm to others are kept away from patients who are prone to harm being caused to them, like young women or women who have mental illnesses and things, which is who you're going to find in a mental health ward.
The general public see that as mental or mental illness, and it's in fact not. I mean, this is actual intoxication with a substance. It may or may not set off something else. It may or may not set off schizophrenia or some other like bipolar disorder, but it's a separate issue. And the problem is that at the moment being lumped in, the issue's being lumped in with all mental illness, but people are also being lumped in together. And we do have a problem. I mean, this is a very difficult group of patients to manage, because they can be very violent and they can be difficult to contain, but they're not the patients that mental health systems are set up to really work with. And of course, when you've got the male-female situation and you've got somebody who's a big, burly, physically aggressive and threatening man who's speeded up on ice, then he's a real risk and threat to women in an inpatient setting, he's also a risk and threat to male patients also and staff.
The current area mental health services we have are like mini pressure cookers a lot of the time, with all these really acutely unwell people in them. And I think some of the nurses actually feel threatened about coming out onto the unit, and if they do confront a male that's behaving inappropriately, that they themselves will be at risk.
I think the point is, though, this is not new. It's been going on forever and ever and ever.
And that's why we need the separate female wards, because then females can be unwell within their parameters and males can be unwell within theirs. But if we're separate, they don't have that interaction with, especially when people become a bit disinhibited or sexually aggressive. If you've got separate units, then that's no longer an issue.
From my own experience, I think there'll be some blokes who'd be more comfortable in a men-only ward as well. It's just that when you are feeling like your best, I think it sometimes helps to simplify things. When you're trying to build yourself up again, you need things as simple as possible. So you don't need like work or bills or whatever. And meeting new people and people you don't know in a social circumstance is always more complicated.
It has been suggested that maybe some men in the psych wards could have problems with women as well, and that would definitely be the case. There's a lot of men who've had relationship difficulties or break up and they may have got ill because of that.
And it's also not good for male patients in services to be in a position where, you know, they might get themselves into situations with women that they wouldn't have been in if they weren't being detained as patients. So, you know, it's in everyone's interests to properly address this issue.
Men have said, well, you know, they don't want to be in the situation where they have done something when they're disinhibited and unwell, and then have to cope with the horribleness and the consequences of that later on as well.
If you had the number of sexual assaults occurring in a general hospital like they occur in a psych hospital, it would have been fixed years ago.
Have we forgotten the fundamentals around the human dignity, respect, kindness, care?
It seems, you know, a pretty clear duty of care to do whatever you can to protect people from sexual assault when they're in a healthcare environment.
That duty of care, I think, well, it is the key argument that, you know, you can't have people who are under the care of the public government domain and have women run at a risk.
This is where people are supposed to be rehabilitated. You know, surely they need peace and tranquility and to be protected from each other. So as a taxpayer, I would be happy to pay whatever it takes for people to be in the right atmosphere so that they can truly recover. We've talked about lots of things today that need fixing, but I would certainly start with women's only wards, and then I'd have a look at age groups, because I'm sure then you'd find some poor sad old men being persecuted by late teenage young men.
People are in there because they are not able at that point in time to make informed choices for themselves. So it's a matter of making sure people have a right to a safe and healing environment. And some women say they're okay within mixed gender areas, particularly during the day. What they want are safe areas of a night time. What they want are staff to be on the wards, out of the fishbowl, onto the wards, engaging with them. They want to be able to lock their rooms. They want to have a space where they can go to be on their own and not in a mixed gender environment.
Both women only and mixed wards have some sense. I think there could be people for whom a mixed environment at a particular stage of their wellness is helpful. I'd certainly say that nobody can understand what it's like to use psych services unless they've been there, but they can decide to be more or less sympathetic to the issues. Often they think that mental health issues won't affect them, it just affects this small subgroup of mentally ill people. It's something people can see, people identify with. Maybe my daughter, my sister, whoever might end up in hospital, and heavens, I wouldn't want this to happen to her.
It'd be great if we could get the politicians, bureaucrats, and other people in the NGO sector and those who have influence over policy and funding to do exactly that, to put themselves in the position of being a consumer on an inpatient unit as a female, or thinking, if they are male, thinking about their mums or their daughters or their sisters or their aunts or a friend or a wife. What would they really want for that particular woman in their life to improve her mental health and to get her back on her feet? And one of the things would be is female-only wards, female-only areas that are real places of healing.
I think there are two things required to reduce the incidence of abuse for female inpatients in psych wards: female-only psych wards and mandatory incident reporting that's taken seriously as a quality assurance check on the way the service is actually running.
The fundamental problem, which is women are getting sexually assaulted in psychiatric care. So that needs to stop. Obviously gendered wards, female-specific wards is one way to do that. But on a practical level, let's think about the level of psychiatric care that we have, and the quality. And obviously the quality is very much degraded by the fact that the wards are crowded. We need more wards. We need more day programs. We need more funding. And obviously the government's just cut the mental health care plan down to 10 sessions maximum per year, which is outrageous. That's less than one session with a psychologist a month. How is anyone, living in a community with a mental illness supposed to cope? So obviously the answer is to increase the budget, because if you look at it from an economic perspective, there is a strong economic incentive for the government to provide funding for these services, because it allows people to participate in the community and in the economy.
I strongly support female-only psychiatric wards. The reason for that is that the current system where we have designated areas for women only isn't working, and it's not working because of the pressure on the beds. And that means that whenever there's a need for a bed, even if it's in a women-only area, then the pressure means that that might be given to a man. So we cannot guarantee there are women-only areas and that they remain women-only areas. So I think we do need women-only wards. We will only achieve that with extra funding being put into the system to enable this to happen.
So yes, we do support the campaign, and we do see a real need every day in our work and our work with our partnership agencies around making more appropriate spaces for women.
To make it safer and to make it more respectful for women. I mean, I think the business of pursuing women-only wards is absolutely vital.
A society like Australia can't justify not providing female-only psychiatric services, and it's got to be a question of not if, but when.
From a human rights perspective and from a common decency perspective, we think women should be entitled to receive and expect treatment without fear of victimisation, sexual assault or re-traumatisation, and we don't see that that can be delivered without women-only psych wards. And Victoria Legal Aid and I fully support the Impatient campaign to reinstate female-only psych wards. It's the right thing to do.
I mean, I just hope that somewhere in our system we can find the enlightenment to start protecting women.
It's not rocket science.
No.
It shouldn't be that hard.
And it used to be called asylum when we were put in hospital, and now it's not asylum, it's a hellhole that people have to endure or come out re-traumatised and even more unwell.
If, God forbid, my daughter went to a psych hospital, I'd absolutely want her to be in a women's ward or a women-only hospital.
If we don't pay attention to women's mental health, then everyone loses, because this is everyone's mother, daughter, sister, wife, and it's about the future of the next generation as well.
Do you think that female-only wards should be reinstated?
Yes, I do think female-only wards should be reinstated.
And why?
Because I think for protection of women, it's the main reason, and that they can feel comfortable being in a ward if they've had experience of rape or abuse from men.
It's a bit like people who are at their most vulnerable being thrown into a fire instead of being given a nice soothing drink of water. And it's just wrong.
I find it completely illogical that women who are acutely ill are in the same units and sharing the same spaces as acutely ill men.
Hey guys, I had an idea. We need a royal commission into Victorian psychiatric hospitals. No, not even Victorian, national. It's a national problem. It's not just Victorian.
Yeah.
Into the welfare of women in psychiatric hospitals, because let's face it, you go in there for treatment, to be healed, and instead you come out traumatised with post-PSTD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and you come out with more problems than you went in with.
Yes, I agree, and the thing that I find most disturbing is that we are still seeing the same issues now that we saw 30 years ago in the big madhouses like Larundel. Nothing has changed.